No, I should have done before going on stage, you used to do the Susie sells seashells.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out and joining us here at Data and Society. If this is your first time here or you're new to Data and Society, what you should know is that we are a research institute and we are trying to understand how data-driven technologies are intersecting with different societal issues. And we end up doing a lot of interesting things here, stemming from really trying to do some grounded research, trying to build out networks of researchers who are trying to make sense of complex issues, and trying to find innovative ways of engaging with broader networks to make certain that this work is connected into the issues that we were actually studying. And so it's been a fun experiment to think about what we've been doing in the realm of artificial intelligence. And so I'm really excited that we're going to have this talk from Madeleine today, because in some ways this work is in a great position right now. We are finishing out a project that has been going on for a couple of years and starting up new work in the area of artificial intelligence. And so this is in some ways both a capstone and an inauguration, if you will, of different kinds of work that we think are really important. So for the last few years, Tim Hwang and Madeleine Elish have been really trying to understand what does intelligence and autonomy look like, and what are the different battlegrounds that are going to emerge over time. Tim rightfully started to realize that as we started talking about machine learning algorithms and different artificial intelligence systems, we were talking about them as though technologies were discrete from one another in different sectors. But indeed, what we kept seeing was that, high-frequency trading is using some of the same basic technical mechanisms as, autonomous vehicles. And what does it mean to start regulating these systems or thinking about the policy issues that are really at stake when we deal with looking at them as domains versus looking at them as technologies? And that was the question that got him started. And he brought Madeleine in to help him make sense of some of the different puzzles that are at play. And together, the two of them have gone back and forth on a whole set of different research, trying to look at things. And what you're going to hear from Madeleine today is one piece of the puzzle, which is the work that they did on the AI pattern language. And in fact, there are books available for those of you who are physically in the room as an opportunity to see this, also available online. But part of it is understanding sort of where the roots of this came from. And one of the pieces that they did in their work that I want to highlight, because I think it's this moment where you can see the innovative thinking, has to do with a term that was coined through a whole set of processes called moral crumple zones. And so Madeleine had been doing some phenomenal work trying to understand the history of the Federal Aviation Administration and their regulation of autopilot, right? Trying to understand how that came into being and what were the ways of thinking at that moment. And what she kept coming back to was that the FAA wanted the solution to be, put humans in the loop. And we've heard this over and over again with new AI systems. If we just put humans in the loop, that will solve all of our problems, right? And she started to interrogate this, and they looked at this and said, "What's going on here?" And realized that at this point, 40 years later from that decision, we now have a moment where actually most planes are flown through autonomous systems. You get on a plane and you hear that nice pilot coming and telling you that everything is good and the safety is underway. But the system itself is primarily automated. But we have a belief and a confidence that there is a human in the loop. But what has become of that human? What has become of that human is that human is now, in many ways, de-skilled on the job, hasn't really flown a plane in a really long time, which will give you a lot of confidence as you're flying, and is expected to step in at the moment of crisis with a magical level of skill to fix the problems. In other words, they've become a liability sponge, right? They're the ones who take the liability for when everything goes wrong. And this is what they started to look at and say, well, how do we understand this? And Tim and Madeleine brought together a group of science fiction writers and put together an event trying to make sense of how this came into being. And the term that came up, which I think eloquently describes what goes on, is the idea of a moral crumple zone. A crumple zone being the part of the car that takes the impact. And what does it mean to effectively take that moral impact? And that's what becomes of human in the loop. So this is just one of the kinds of interventions that they developed over the process of trying to think about this, because it reframes how we think about AI systems. And I think that that's one of the important things we can do right now is question not whether the stuff is, ethically good or ethically bad. It's going to be a mess. But how do we actually frame and understand what's at stake? So today's event is going to be a recognition of what is needed moving forward. And so what you're going to hear from Madeleine is a description of some of the work she did as she tried to make sense of what people were doing who are practitioners of AI. How are they thinking about it? And the work that she and Tim and a network of other people did to try to make sense of the implications to this. And I think this is a really important time to be having this conversation. Conversations about AI, governance, and ethics are flourishing at this moment, fragmented, if you will, but happening all over the place. And we need to get past simplistic understandings of things like the trolley car problem to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what is at stake. And hopefully, we're going to be embarking on a lot of work in that area, and I'm excited that Madeleine's going to be leading the charge in a lot of this. Before I turn it over to Madeleine, I just want to say that we are deeply committed to trying to understand issues and also to build networks. So if you're working in this space, please come and engage with us. Make certain that we can understand what you're doing, how we bring people together as part of the fun and opportunity here. If you aren't an active member of DNS, join our newsletter, follow us on social media. If you are here, where is Audrey? There is Audrey with a bright red lipstick. Talk to her. She's a great person to make certain that you're in contact with all of the relevant people. But one of the things we hope to do is really make this into a much more complex conversation because the issues themselves are very complex. And there's a lot of opportunity and room right now to try to figure them out. Without further ado, let me introduce Madeleine.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, not? Okay. Let's see. Oh, am I going to do this or this? Nope. Yes. So I want to start with a story. I was talking with a lead designer for Microsoft's Cortana, their personal assistant, about their design process. And this designer told me a story. We'll call him Elliot. And Elliot said to me, there was this idea to potentially work on and develop that if someone yelled at their phone or cursed at it, maybe we could make it run faster. I very quickly, this is Elliot, made a comment saying, I don't want to teach my children that yelling at someone makes them perform better. I want to use this technology to help build interpersonal social models. Now, this may sound crazy to everyone in the room who would, this is perhaps an apocryphal story. Who would do that? But it's actually not that crazy. And I think that Elliot, while not uncommon in the field of practitioners, is not the majority. And in fact, this photo here comes from an article describing a potential technology that would that involved charging a phone by yelling at it. Right? So this is actually this is a real kind of challenge that people need to be grappling with. So with that stage set, today I want to do a few things. First, I want to thank you all again for coming. And I also want to think more deeply about the context in which Elliot and his team of designers are working, and sort of what are the driving values and goals and environments in which it becomes a potentially good idea to yell at your phone. And I want to do this because as critical practitioners in the room, and especially as social science researchers here, we need to think about these decisions not as just sort of stupid, misguided decisions, but really understand, in order to change, why the outcomes of particular ways of building technologies are actually structured from within the industry itself. And this is because if we want to have meaningful effects on the shape of technology, we need to be bridging the worlds of industry and academic research more strongly, especially social science research. And I think each side needs to hear and recognize the contributions of the other. And so as Dana mentioned, Tim and I were interested in finding ways to reframe some of the discussions that were going on. And so Tim and I set out on the research project that I'm about to tell you about. We set out to kind of to use it as building bridges between these kinds of practitioners and researchers, and particularly practitioners who are working in the field of intelligent systems and AI. So with that preamble, I'll give you a quick preview of what's ahead. First, I'm going to talk about what we talk about when we talk about AI and why we're talking about it all wrong. And then I'll tell you a bit more about the AI pattern language itself and some of the lessons that we've learned from this interview-based project. And then finally, I'll conclude by drawing out some more of the kind of more broad insights that I think we can develop from the research we conducted with the pattern language. So what do we talk about when we talk about AI? If you get your information from, yes, good, sorry, I was looking at this. If you get your information about artificial intelligence, machine learning, or robotics from popular news sources, your information is most likely wrong. This is especially true if you glean information from the headlines or the first paragraphs of news stories. For instance, this 2014 Wired article headlined, "Artificial Intelligence is now telling doctors how to treat you," followed a familiar pattern of using one small advance in technology, usually still in a testing or limited release phase, to extrapolate to all AI technology. And I'm sure this doesn't surprise anyone in the room. Coverage of AI takes place at the extremes. AI will threaten the survival of humanity, or AI will save humanity. But focusing on these extremes, I think, needs to be more than just an observation, and leads to the insight that when we focus on the extremes, we draw attention away from the real and present technologies and effects that are taking place. And so, moreover, when Tim and I thought about conducting this research, we wanted to not think about future, but rather what was happening now. But what do we talk about when we talk about AI? Well, I actually really like Russell and Norvig's definition, which says that the history of artificial intelligence has not clearly produced a definition of AI, but rather can be seen as emphasizing 4 possible goals: systems that think like humans, systems that act like humans, systems that think rationally, and systems that think rationally, and systems that act rationally. So I think that this is a good kind of technical definition, but I think it's limited if our purpose is to sort out the social implications of AI, because AI, as it exists in the world, is shaped by the social perceptions of that technology. Not only what it is, but what people think it is. And so part of our research for the pattern language, which I'll get to in a moment, this slipperiness of the term AI was actually a recurring theme in our interviews. And we actually asked everyone we interviewed what they meant when they used the term AI. And I think that this quote sums it up really well. Artificial intelligence tends to be both the scariest, but also the most universal term. If I walk into a room and said, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, this was personal assistance, nearly everyone would have a picture in their head. The problem is that everybody's picture would be different. Now, this is useful for marketing ideas, pitching ideas, but it can have unintended consequences for how the public understands technology and what its limitations are, right? Because robots fall over, they fail, and they fail in often unexpected ways. And we have to think not just about public understandings of technology and whatever that might mean, but the idea that lay understandings of technology inform local and federal government agendas, right? So, and that can lead these kinds of governments to quickly adopt unproven technologies. So in sum, AI is blurry and nebulous, and this vagueness is consequential because it allows us to confuse aspirations and accomplishments. So now on to the meat, the kind of AI pattern language itself. As I mentioned, the previous sort of perspectives that I've mentioned about AI came from work that we did on something called the AI pattern language, which we hoped would be a taxonomy of social challenges meeting technologists designing and deploying intelligent systems. What this means, what our goal was to articulate a series of common challenges that were emerging at the junctions between humans and intelligent systems. And not just what social scientists thought those tension points were, but really what people who were working in the field with technologies right now were understanding as the social problems they needed to address. Now, it's also, oh yes, that's the cover. And Dana didn't mention, but the books are for your taking. They are for free. So information is free in this case. So I should also say the inspiration for this project came from a really unique collection of architectural theory by Christopher Alexander, Sarah Ishikawa, and Murray Silverstein, found in something called A Pattern Language and A Timeless Way of Building, both from 1977. And in these works, Alexander and his team developed what they viewed as best practices for designing a city. And the patterns that Alexander developed embody an aspirational vision of a beautiful and efficient city planning, how to make beautiful doorways and pathways and living rooms. And it's interesting to think that this pattern language was coming in response to the reigning paradigms of urban renewal and centralized city planning of the 70s. Alexander and his team wanted to create an alternative way to build a shared world. There's actually this really beautiful, beautiful quote from, it's a lovely, very thick, very expensive book, but you can find it online, again, for free. And there's this beautiful quote from Alexander that I think really characterizes their approach. And it says, "This is a fundamental way of viewing the world. It says that when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but also must repair the world around it and within it, so that the larger world at one place becomes more coherent, more whole, and the thing which you make takes its place in the web of nature as you make it." So in a pattern language, Christopher's pattern language, the central problem is the built environment. While our goals were not as grand as the city planner, Tim and I really took inspiration from the values of equity and mutual responsibility, as well as actually the accessible form of a pattern language. This is not an academic paper in an academic journal. And like those patterns, we wanted to create a common language of problems and potential solutions that appear in different contexts at different scales of intervention. Still, I should point out that a significant difference in the AI pattern language is that our pattern language is not meant to be prescriptive. That is, our inclusion of each pattern is not an endorsement of that pattern, but rather a collection as a means to inform, widen perspectives, populate this kind of mutual language. So I briefly do want to just gloss over our methodology. Our methodology was interview-based. It was over the course of 8 months. We visited AI companies and industrial labs, attended industry and academic conferences, conducted in-depth interviews with over 40 individuals, some of whom are here. Thank you for coming. And our method of selecting sites and participants was guided by an initial survey of the companies working in this space and the thought leaders, which we gathered from other sort of surveying organizations. And then we proceeded through 3 rounds of interviews, each round gathering new participants through a snowball method of sampling. So given this subjective and self-selective formation of the participant pool, the people we spoke with cannot be claimed to be representative in an empirical sense. We didn't explicitly seek out racial, gender, or age diversity, and consequently, the vast majority of people we spoke with were white men under the age of 55, which actually very much reflects the existing representative, or is an accurate, relatively accurate reflection of the existing demographics of who's working in these spaces. Still, still, again, we see this project, this research, as not prescriptive, but rather as a catalyst to begin the kinds of conversations that need to be having across industries and domains. So we organized our findings into 4 main challenges that we saw emerge across industries. As Dana mentioned, Tim and I were really interested in saying, all right, people are looking at looking at AI technologies, domain specific. What happens if we look across all of these sectors? And so the people that we spoke with ranged from, people working on drones for farmers to robo-finance. But across all of these domains, we saw 4 main challenges. One was assuring users perceive good intentions. Another was protecting privacy. Another was establishing successful and long-term adoption. And finally, demonstrating accuracy and reliability. I should say that these problems and tension points emerged as organically the problems that our interviewees stressed as needing to be addressed, as seeing sort of within their realm of responsibility, and that's exactly what we were interested in capturing. And so within each of these 4 challenges, we drew 3 or 4 patterns that represented the ways that different people were addressing these challenges. And so now I'll go through a few of these examples for each challenge. And I'm only sort of picking one pattern out of what is several in each challenge. So first challenge, assuring users perceive good intentions. In contrast to many discussions that occur in social science and even government, or that used to occur in government, those we spoke with did not focus on the potential that their products might result in inequality or injustice. Perhaps because each founder or designer relies on the self-knowledge of their own good intentions, they believe in the product, and they want it to do well. Still, across sectors, cultivating trust between a user and a system was seen as perhaps the foundational social aspect of designing and deploying intelligent systems. And the main avenue people thought about this challenge was through the idea of transparency. Still, what transparency means and to what degree it can be offered varied within the responses. So for instance, the first pattern I'll talk about or just touch on emphasize the way that trust can be achieved between a user and a computer by making the human visible in the interaction, even when the human can seem absent, even if it's personalized. That boiled down to show the man behind the curtain. So also for each pattern, I'll give a quick quote, which sort of can stand as an emblem for the perspective represented in each pattern. So speaking about a discovery feature, a project manager explained how through the design process, they realized that they needed to make their product not feel creepy. And I'm sure anyone who works in this space knows that we talk about this a lot, actually. How do we make it not feel creepy? It had to feel human. And he explained, we make it like a gift for you, the user, each week. Sometimes we get it right, but like a human, the product can have good weeks and bad weeks. He emphasized, we want our users to know that our products are powered by people. Moving on to challenge number 2, assuring or protecting privacy. Another really common challenge was this idea of what do we do about data privacy? And here there were significantly divergent views, the span of which is represented in the full set of patterns for this challenge. Some people thought it was the bedrock of creating a good technology. And those people had particular technical and design processes to ensure privacy by design. One of my favorite quotes, actually, from this research was a machine learning startup founder who said, "Privacy is still a very important part of the founding of this country." And so, man, I have a lot of things to say. And he did. We talked for a really long time. But many also found that the ideas around privacy were simply misguided. And so that leads me to talking about number 8. Ignore the anxiety around privacy. It's a red herring. So viewing privacy as fundamentally relative, which most of the people we spoke with agreed, a number of our interviewees held the view that focusing on data privacy is simply misguided. The founder of a leading machine learning company based in Silicon Valley explained that privacy is simply a historical construct and is mistaken as important today. He used the example of reactions to Gmail, and someone else actually used this example to illustrate his point, that when it launched, it was a really huge deal. And now, no one cares if Gmail reads your email. He found that focusing on the notion of privacy held back innovation. He concluded, yes, there's a sense of impatience on my part. We will adapt to new technology and we will evolve. The third common challenge, and of course all of these challenges are interrelated and are sort of variously constitutive of each other, my academicness showing through. But the third common challenge was establishing successful and long-term adoption. And particularly was interesting, the patterns we found in this challenge emerged around the concept of control. That is, how and to what extent should users of or collaborators with intelligence systems be in control? And actually this led to my favorite pattern of all, which is pattern number 9. Always ask who is being made the hero. So the first time I heard this theme emerge was early on in our interviews, and I was talking to a human-computer interaction designer, and he explained, at the beginning of my career, I worked in an IT department, and we were all about making people's jobs simpler. But that means their job isn't necessary. But everyone wants to be better at their job, because being better is about adding value to the company. So ever since then, this perspective has framed how he thinks about the problem of integrating new systems into existing workflows, and how the value of that introduction should be framed. A human factors engineer working on a drone system, actually for farmers, put it more explicitly. Everybody wants to be the hero of their own story. And so in designing their intelligence system, the central question he and his team kept in mind was, how do you actually have autonomy under the hood and yet make the user feel like they're in control? If you have an autonomous or semi-autonomous technology coming in and they're not the hero, they're going to resist that. And so finally, challenge number 4, demonstrating accuracy. That is, that a product actually worked and did what it was supposed to do. And not just that it did what it was supposed to do, but that people believed that it did what it was supposed to do. Everyone cited this as a recurring challenge. And one major obstacle in many ways was the technology itself. That is, that these technologies are extremely complex. As the founder of a machine learning company explained, there's so much mystique related to machine learning. There's a combination of the customers wanting to understand it as much as possible, but at the same time, assuming they can't get into the details. Because it's unknown, there's this powerful desire to understand, but at the same time, it's complicated. Even if you start explaining it to people, they will just kind of zone out. And so in order to address that challenge, the pattern that I'll focus on here is to explain the conditions of accuracy. One engineer explained that while some clients and users want to understand how this kind of analysis is better than what they're currently using, the engineer said, people just always ask, I want to know how accurate it is. Give me the accuracy. Well, in our case, accuracy is a really poor metric to know how good this API is because you have 111 categories. And we would say, great, we've got 45% accuracy. But they're like, 45%? That's terrible. I'm looking for something close to 100. And then we're like, no, wait, this was a young founder. No, no, wait, okay, hold on and think about it for a second. There are 111 categories. Many of them are very similar, like fitness and dieting. So they're like, give me a number that I can say is accuracy. Long story short, what the engineer explained to us is that we usually just come up with proxy numbers where we can give you the best sense that corresponds to what you believe is accuracy. Accuracy needs to be translated. Okay, so what does this all mean? I've just presented you with a series of hopefully interesting patterns. But if they're just illustrative and not prescriptive, what do we really learn? Well, I would argue that we learn several things. Broadly, we learn what areas concern practitioners and how practitioners frame the problems that they feel compelled to solve. And I think the two insights follow from this. First, when we collect the set of challenges seen as needing to be addressed, we consequently see what's left out. And again, what is seen as not needing to be addressed. And therefore, we can understand more specifically how responsibility for the social impact of technology is passed on, leaving many problems unaddressed. And so to dig deeper into this point, actually, throughout our interviews, we noticed the same reasons being given again and again as to why certain social dimensions or impacts were left unaddressed. One had to do with the size of the company. It limited what they could do. And then the other was that they had to prioritize limited resources. We might call this the Goldilocks problem. Like the fairy tale Goldilocks, the company was always too big or too small, never just right, for anyone to take specific responsibility for all of the impacts. Individuals in large corporations, for example, felt it wasn't their responsibility because teams are highly specialized and often siloed. And a designer actually at a multinational corporation explained, there's a whole team of lawyers I never see who deal with that stuff. The responsibility always seems to lie somewhere else. For smaller companies who have services that are licensed by larger companies, the responsibility just seems out of their hands. For instance, a designer working in a medical technology company was concerned about privacy debates, but the product was business to business, B2B, and so it wasn't really within his control. And I think a VC put it, I didn't put it up. I think one VC put it really well. He said, to be honest, like most entrepreneurs, they're just trying to keep the company going, trying to grow the company. And the larger scale implications, oftentimes they don't think about it until they're quite successful or they're further along and actually have a chance to look back. Interestingly, a product manager at a recommendation service put it in slightly different terms and posed it around the idea of resource allocation. While he may want his team to go back and fully understand why one iteration of an algorithm did one thing and another didn't, that was time wasted, he said. He explained that time spent thinking about why or to what end is time that his engineers are not developing a new product. That is, often the immediate costs outweigh the long-term benefits. And again, so I would like to sort of say, so what have we learned? And I think that what is important is that the social impacts practitioners see as within their control, their responsibility, are specifically framed in terms of their corporate position. And I think, again, moreover, we learn how these problems are framed. And this, again, leads to the second insight, which is, again, perhaps an obvious point, but bears repeating in the context of the endeavor to address the social implications of intelligent systems, which requires the collaboration between industry practitioners, policymakers, academic researchers, and other experts. In particular, it becomes clear how the different contexts within which experts must deal with technological problems inform the very ways in which a problem is framed. Like a language, these differing perspectives produce different ways of thinking and talking, ways that may be opaque to others outside those environments. And so we need to ask, when these diverse communities come to the same table, are they talking about the same things? For instance, confronting the privacy implications of intelligent systems has been a central concern for both academic and industry practitioners, but with differing commitments. While the language of industry uses terms like data collection and data security to describe the kinds of techniques that can impinge upon individual privacy, academic discussions tend to use terms such as surveillance, which invoke the asymmetrical dynamics of control and power. While the industry patterns demonstrate an emphasis on finding levers to control the local effects of intelligent systems, social scientific scholars have been more attuned to the systemic effects and invoke the language of governance. So while both communities care about the issues of privacy, what these issues are and why they matter is distinct. There we go. So just to reiterate, each challenge as it emerges from industry is essentially and understandably about developing a productive relationship between a user or client and a product or company. And if we were to think about what such parallel challenges might be in the context of social science, these challenges would likely be about articulating a social value that exceeds any product-user relationship. And because most researchers are focused on broad social implications and systemic factors, their approach to analysis is often at odds with the individual consumer-centric perspective of the practitioners we encountered. And the dilemma is not that communities differ in focus, but rather that this difference, thus far, seems to create an unbreachable barrier to understanding and collaboration. And so in getting to the end of this presentation, I just want to emphasize this idea that was the motivator for the AI pattern language, which was to begin building bridges and developing a common language. And I think that that is what the next steps for research in the AI implications domain needs to be. We need to drill down deeper and continue these conversations using perhaps, hopefully, the kinds of tools and frames we've developed here. So I hope that in the past year, the specter of superintelligence and the singularity has begun to recede. Media coverage, as well as scholarly conferences and output, have begun to focus more on these pressing concerns, many of which I think we began to address here. Still, the need for a nuanced understanding of social implications of intelligent systems remains. And for instance, recent appeals to developing codes of ethics and developing ethical technologies hold out promise, but they're far from an automatic success. The social implications of intelligent systems deployment are highly contextual and must ultimately be examined as such. So while this looked across domains, I think now we also need to drill down into specific domains. So in sum, we're all in this together. Hopefully everyone here in this room, part of the data and society community, and all of those that we touch. And I want to believe that we can build a better future with technology and with AI technologies. But I think that will take connecting across disciplines and industries and the mutual shaping of practice and critique. And so intelligent systems are not out of our control, and they're not magical, nor are they objective or perfect, and they are compounds of specific human choices. And every decision matters. So thank you. I also want to thank all of the people who made this project possible, especially research support was primarily supported through the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and also Tim Hwang, who couldn't be here today. Angie Waller has done so much. She was the art director for the book. It's like huge. Thank you. I don't know where you are. There you are. Right. Jeff Yattel and Sarah Nichols, who did the art design. So thank you. I'm happy to take comments.
So it's now time to invite you to ask questions, both of this work in particular, as well as the broader work that Madeleine's been working on. What do you want to know? And also, because so many of you are experts, what do you want to share that we should be thinking about, and Madeleine in particular should be thinking about? Questions?
Hi. Hi. So I've been thinking, through your whole talk about the difference between an AI-specific version of some of these questions and, in general, the question of that all technologists have to face about unintended consequences of their work. So, smartphones, there's more people dying on the highways, texting. The democratization of media has led to fake news crisis, et cetera. Do you feel that there are specifically things about the work that machine learning researchers do in the AI community in general that are either deeper, go beyond that, or harder?
What do you think?
I think the stakes, I think that mostly they're the same problems. In some cases, the stakes can be higher because the systems can be more capable. And it gets into, the impacts to the economy, to the labor force, how people, and people's identity, right? Because especially when you talk about machines taking over people's jobs, then there's economic impacts, and then there's some sort of deep, what are human questions that come out of it. But I think that the way that those questions ought to be grappled with are probably the same, and I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I think that's why it's good to have this work be done at Data and Society, because we're all sort of thinking about these issues. I think that there are some specific, some AI-specific contexts and implications that need to be considered, and I'm not sure if it's because of the technology itself, but rather the way the technology is packaged as AI. As I think even the word like intelligent, the kind of belief of the role that social perception will have on how much people will trust and incorporate systems into some of these big governance issues, right? Like less about do you get a better search result, but more like how is your credit score evaluated? I'm worried that whereas big data was still subject to systems, which in some way we were able to think about interrogating, AI sort of black boxes big data in a way. I don't know, I'm just sort of talking out loud, but I think that there's something that's really systemic about it.
Hi. I have like a specific question and then kind of a more general one, but the specific one is around this making things less creepy thing that you mentioned. And is there a parallel between these, say, the Uncanny Valley in like humanoid robotics and these more disembodied interfaces, right? Like a software chatbot or a Siri, Alexa type voice command thing. And then I guess the more general question is, it seems like you've done this kind of descriptive grammar of these patterns. Do you have any thoughts of what's next for, say, a more prescriptive one of what could be possible or what you would sort of recommend?
I think you're totally right about the Uncanny Valley thing. Yeah, that it's just sort of that in like textual form in this way. Actually, Cortana's notebook, you can flip it open and like see what she knows about you, and so it becomes a way to like. Yeah, there are different ways that people are trying to bridge that Uncanny Valley, but I think you're right to draw that parallel. And in terms of prescriptive, in a way, I think that would have to be done in collaboration with a designer or something, right? Like, from my position, I can think and critique and bring historical analysis, but anything that would be prescriptive about practices that'd be awesome. I'd love to do it, but it would have to be in collaboration with some of the people I was talking to, I would say.
Thank you for that. I really appreciated at the beginning that you wanted us to focus not on sort of this Manichaean story of AI is going to save us or kill us, but rather look at it in a more granular way, in which, it's not obvious it's a natural kind. What I wanted to ask you was really, in the whole data governance conversation, it often feels like you have groups of us social scientists who recognize ways of looking at things structurally. And the conversation's often like, well, it's too bad the technologists don't have these grammars and vocabularies and ways of looking at sort of things. And often in the same room, the technologists will walk away like, what the hell are they talking about? I remember someone screaming at me on the one train after a wonderful conference about that. But I guess my question is this. You used a metaphor of translation at the end. But it strikes me one of the great promises of what you've done is the granularity of analysis of your practitioners. What's the significance for making better social science about this, if we understand that? So make it prescriptive in a different way. How, as we as social scientists, not just translate that, but think differently as a result of the patterns that you're looking at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some ways it necessitates a different orientation toward what the work of social science is, which is that it needs to be continually engaged with practices and to not say, well, those people, they just don't get it, right? And I think rather than constantly setting up other people's decisions as just being misguided, that social scientists, what they could do is, I guess that social science needs to be more in dialogue, and I think needs to understand what's actually happening as opposed to what people think is happening or social scientists think happening. I don't know if that's exactly addressing your problem. I want to think about it more. I mean, it's something that I grapple a lot with. What do we do with this? I mean, I hope in some ways this is we being academics. I don't know. I think I would love to, continue that conversation after.
I was thinking about your four-point definition of AI, and you talked about rational intelligence. I'm not aware of any system out there that actually is rationally intelligent, so I've always wondered why we even besides from a marketing standpoint, AI sounds good, there really is no intelligence there. And as to that other gentleman that he said, it's similar to any kind of decision support system. So, take the ultimate test of an AI system is being able to pass the Turing test. And no AI system is able to, as of today, do that. And their knowledge is very brittle. Even from 40 years ago when Buchanan and Shortliff came up with Dengel and mice, and I raised this because you talked about being able to diagnose diseases. That's what 40 years ago it did, but it was very brittle because it asked men whether they were pregnant or not. And the same kind of problem exists today with, for example, Watson. Watson is great at playing Jeopardy, but 3 years ago they announced a joint venture with Sloan Kettering to be able to diagnose cancer, and 3 years later there's nothing to show for it. So.
I can't speak directly to all of the specific projects that you're mentioning. I think in many ways I'm extremely skeptical of anything that it claims to be intelligent. I think one thing is that artificial intelligence, though, as a discipline, really has transformed since 40 years ago. Sort of expert system symbolic reasoning, as opposed to the machine learning that we have, machine learning-driven work that we have now, I think approach problems in fundamentally different ways. And so I think that's where those four categories of think rationally, act rationally, it becomes interesting to see what during any particular time, any moment in time, technical sciences are interested in achieving as sort of valuing as the most intelligent.
I would also go back to the point you just made with respect to machine learning. Neural networks existed 40 years ago. The problem, the impetus today for neural networks and machine learning is the amount of hardware that we have and the amount of data that we have. The combination of the hardware and the data is what allowed Watson to play Jeopardy so well.
Hey, thanks. It was a really great talk and a fantastic project. I wanted to focus in on the use of the pattern language as like a precedent and like a way of talking about this, because that was the book that got me interested in cities when I was like 19 years old.
Wow.
And it was probably like the most prominent of a lot of books that came out of urban planning and architecture in the 60s and 70s, and that they were like really doggedly anti-professional, anti-formal architecture, anti-formal city planning, and glorifying like vernacular solutions to problems. And that's really what pattern language is like, this is what society over thousands of years has said the answer to, like, you know, housing children is, or letting light into buildings. And the reason I bring that up is, you know, most of the interviews you talked about were like highly trained specialists attacking, you know, corporate or like university defined like institutional problems. And I wonder how different this would look if it was like hackers, activists, and there may not even be enough like samples out there to interview of how people are using this technology to pursue totally different agendas that may not even be so like reductionist in the way they approach problems.
Yeah,
so it'd be really cool, I think, to extend the study further.
That'd be a really interesting way to extend it. I hadn't thought about that avenue of extension, but that's super interesting. I mean, our project was particularly bounded to sort of look at, all right, if we're looking at like this corporate rise of AI, like what is that like on the inside? But you know, another way that I thought about extending, or that we thought about extending the project, would be to people obviously on the sort of receiving end, right? So we're only talking about designers and implementers. But there are many other sort of sides to the problem. But I like that idea.
Yeah, I actually have kind of a related question. So a lot of the patterns that you identify have something to do with sort of some kind of negotiation in terms of the relative status or role of the human in coordination with these systems or within these systems. And I'm kind of curious because you mentioned sort of towards the beginning, and Dana mentioned in her introduction, that you've done work that's historical on this in the 1940s. And of course, the sort of pattern language comes from a reference in the 1950s where something very interesting is happening in AI as well. So I'm wondering if you have any sense of how this negotiation changes, or how the terms of this negotiation has changed as the emphasis historically has shifted from these sort of 4 cardinal points of AI that you identified from Russell and Norvig in the beginning.
I don't know, but that's really cool. I would love to, yeah. I don't know. Good question.
This is great. Thanks for sharing. One question, as you spoke with all these different practitioners, I was curious if it came up, the subjectivity of the creators, the subjectivity of the teams behind it. You talked about white men, but I'm curious how much, or if there were patterns or conversations of awareness or questions that came up in terms of the actual makers and the team dynamics and organizational dynamics, because that is such a key part of how these systems are actually created in the world.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think they're not represented as such in the language because, perhaps also because I was interviewing people and not teams. I'm sure if I had actually set up the interview as being with a lab that was working on something or a product team, that would have emerged. Trying to think if there are any patterns where that sort of shows through. I don't think so, but I think that might have been the way that I was like framing the question. So, yeah. Sorry, I can't answer that either.
So artificial intelligence is in many ways here to stay. It's a concept, but it's also a set of hope and value about what technology can or should be able to do. And for better or for worse, we are seeing technology enter into a ton of different domains as the solution to age-old, long-standing problems, hoping that if we can find a way through it technologically, we don't have to grapple with the messy ugliness of dealing with the people part of it all. And yet, as is very clear, both from Madeleine's work and from broader efforts around AI, we actually are going to have to grapple with the people part of it all even more so in order to make sense of this. And this means understanding not just how these technologies get built, but how they are understood within cultural discourse. Understanding what people imagine them to do, as well as what they actually do. And the distinctions and differences between those are some of the hardest puzzles that we have to face as we go forward. With that in mind, I think it is now time to enjoy the people part of this event, which also happens to include the alcohol part of this event. And so, as a reminder, there's copies of the books so that you can deep dive into what Madeleine has given us so graciously an opportunity to get a good sense of. The other thing is that because we are turning this into the people and social part of the conversation, which means you don't want to continue sitting lecture style, my hope is that all of you will work with the staff to help move the chairs as fast as possible. And so putting them over there is going to be really key to all of this. So follow Marina. Marina's smiling at you. She will give you instructions. And more importantly, I hope you enjoy the evening. And thank you so much, Madeleine.